Welcome back to Gravepath Stories. Tonight, I have 8 true New Year's horror stories for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the grave path, you don't walk alone. I was tightening the last clamp on the antenna arm when the voice came through my headset counting down from 60, calm and steady. Like it belonged there, like I hadn't been alone on that tower for hours already. I froze with my gloves half twisted, listening, telling myself it had to be interference, some stray broadcast bleeding through the line. But the voice kept going, each number spoken cleanly, evenly spaced, no static at all. And when it reached 0, it didn't stop. It just started again from 60, slower this time, heavier, as if someone were leaning close to a microphone and breathing between the words. I checked my watch, because that's what you do when something feels wrong. And it wasn't even close to midnight yet, not by hours. And the town below was still lit up, still busy, fireworks scheduled for later, not now. I called into base, asked if anyone was running tests on the channel, and got only the hiss of open air in response. I switched frequencies, then another, and the countdown followed me every time, slipping neatly into place like it had been waiting. I remember laughing once, a short sound that fogged inside my mask, because it felt easier than admitting my hands were shaking. I told myself it was fatigue, cold nerves, the kind of tricks your mind plays when you've been awake too long. I'd worked New Year's Eve shifts before. Nothing about this should have been different. Still, I turned my body so I could see the service road below, just to reassure myself there was a way down if I needed it. The voice reached 0 again, and this time it didn't reset. Instead, there was a pause so deep it felt like pressure in my ears. And then a different sound came through, a sharp intake of breath, followed by shouting, not cheering, not celebration. Someone was yelling coordinates, another voice cut in crying, and then a third screamed something I couldn't make out before the signal snapped dead. I said, "Hello," into the mic, my own voice sounding thin and wrong, and for a moment nothing answered. Then the line clicked, and a man spoke fast and tight, asking for confirmation, asking if anyone was receiving him, asking if evacuation protocols had been initiated yet. I asked him who he was talking to, and he went quiet, then asked me what year it was. When I told him, he swore and said I wasn't supposed to be hearing any of this yet. Before I could ask what that meant, the transmission cut out, replaced by another countdown, starting at 10 this time, spoken by a woman who sounded like she was trying not to cry. I ripped the headset off and held it away from my ear, but the voice kept going, leaking out faintly, tinny and insistent. Down in town, a test firework burst early, a bright flash, and then everything went silent. No cheering followed, no echoing booms. Just a sudden, unnatural quiet that rolled up the hill and wrapped around the tower. I could feel it in my chest, the absence of sound pressing inward. Then, far below, someone screamed. One voice at first, then another, then many, rising together in a way that made my stomach drop because it didn't sound chaotic. It sounded organized, like a response to something unseen. I forced myself to breathe, to think step by step. I put the headset back on and called bass again, louder now, sharper, demanding a response. The line crackled, and a familiar voice answered. My supervisor, sounding confused and irritated, asking why I was calling during scheduled blackout. I told him about the countdown, about the calls, about the screaming, and he told me to stop messing around, that the system logs showed nothing unusual, no incoming transmissions, no outgoing ones either. As he spoke, another voice overlapped his, cutting through with perfect clarity, reporting a structural failure downtown, time-stamped a full year ahead of the current date. I shouted for my supervisor to listen, to hear it, but he couldn't. He swore at me, told me to get off the tower and head back once my shift ended, then signed off. I stood there gripping the railing, my breath loud in my ears, while the headset filled with calls that no one else could hear. Fires, collapses, injuries, each one stamped with dates from the coming year. Times precise, locations exact. Between them, the countdowns returned, always ending before midnight, never reaching the moment everyone was waiting for. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was shock. Maybe some part of me believed that if I listened long enough, I'd understand. The screams from town rose and fell, then stopped entirely, replaced by a low murmur like a crowd holding its breath. When I finally climbed down, my legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The service road was empty. No vehicles. No lights moving. As I drove toward town, the radio in the truck turned itself on, playing back the same emergency calls I'd heard on the tower. I slammed it off. But the voices kept coming from the speakers, softer now, closer, like they were inside the cab with me. At the edge of town, I saw people standing in the street, frozen, faces turned upward, eyes wide. Fireworks lay unlit on the ground around them. I got out and asked what happened, but no one answered. Then, as one, they all screamed again, and in that moment every screen in every window lit up, showing footage from the future, disasters yet to come, playing on a loop. The countdown began one last time, everywhere at once, and when it reached 0, the screens went dark. The people stopped screaming. Midnight passed without a sound. The year turned, officially, quietly. I spent the next year listening, reporting, being ignored, and every time an incident occurred exactly as I'd heard it, I marked it down. When the final call came through, the one dated tonight, I shut everything off and left the tower for good. I didn't stay to hear the screams this time. I already knew they were coming, and I knew no one would believe me, not until it was too late. I was halfway through my second patrol loop when the first firework reflected off the water in a way that made me stop walking and lean over the railing. Because the reflection didn't break the way it should have. It stretched, held together longer than the explosion above it. Like something in the harbor was gripping the light and refusing to let go. I remember thinking it was just my eyes, that long nights do that to you. But when the next burst went off, and the reflection did the same thing, I stayed still and watched, instead of moving on like I was supposed to. I keyed my radio and told dispatch everything looked normal so far, because technically it did. And because I didn't have the words yet for what felt off. My boots were planted, my hand on the rail, and below me the water looked thicker than usual, darker, like it had depth in places it shouldn't. Between fireworks, when the sky went momentarily black, I thought I saw shapes rise just beneath the surface and then sink again, not splashing, not breaking water, just shifting it. I told myself it was debris, logs, maybe seals moving closer in because of the noise. I'd worked the harbor long enough to know the stories people tell about what lives out there, and I'd always been the one rolling my eyes. I wasn't about to start believing them now. Still, I adjusted my flashlight and shined it down between explosions, sweeping the beam slowly. The light didn't reach as far as it should have. It faded fast, swallowed up, and that bothered me more than the shapes. Another firework went off, red this time, and its reflection showed something that looked almost like a line of heads, spaced evenly apart, just for a second. I straightened up so fast my shoulder cracked, heart jumping, and when I leaned back over, there was nothing there but water and light ripples from the blast overhead. I called dispatch again, asked if any boats were scheduled to be out after curfew. They told me no, same as always on New Year's, harbor locked down, all registered vessels accounted for. I acknowledged, tried to sound normal, and kept walking, though I stayed closer to the edge than before, eyes flicking down every few steps. As the fireworks picked up, the reflections multiplied, overlapping, turning the water into a fractured mirror. That's when I noticed movement that didn't match the timing of the explosions. Between bursts, something surfaced, slow and deliberate, enough to push water aside without breaking it. I stopped again, swallowed, and forced myself to keep breathing steadily. "Harbor security to dispatch," I said, keeping my voice low. I might have unregistered movement near Pier 3. There was a pause before they answered, longer than usual, and when they did, the dispatcher sounded distracted, like they were listening to something else. They asked me to repeat myself. I did, slower. They told me to keep eyes on it and report back if anything breached the surface. The word breached sat wrong in my head. I watched. Firework. Reflection, darkness, movement. Again and again, the same pattern. And then, all at once, the fireworks stopped. Not faded out. Not one last echo. They just cut off, leaving a silence so sudden it made my ears ring. The reflections vanished with them, plunging the harbor into a darkness that felt heavier than night should. In that silence, the water moved. Something broke the surface this time, not fully. Just enough for me to see a shape that wasn't debris, wasn't an animal I recognized. It slipped back under before I could focus on it, leaving only widening circles that bumped gently against the pier supports. My radio crackled, and before I could call in, voices poured out of it. Not one transmission, but many layered on top of each other. People shouting coordinates, people screaming names, people begging for help. I heard the words sinking more than once, and I heard metal groaning, wood splintering, water rushing. I spun in a slow circle, radio held out in front of me, as if the source might be standing there in the dark. "Dispatch," I said sharply. "I'm getting multiple distress calls. Confirm." No answer from dispatch. Just more voices. A man shouting that he couldn't see the lights anymore. A woman crying that something had grabbed the hull. Another voice, older, strangely calm, stating the name of a boat I'd never heard of, followed by a registration number that didn't match our system. I tried switching channels. The calls followed. I turned the radio volume down. They got quieter, but they didn't stop. "Security," one voice said suddenly, clear and close, like they were speaking directly to me. "We're in the harbor. We don't see you." I felt cold spread through my chest. Identify your vessel? I demanded, training taking over even as my hands shook. There was a pause, then confusion. We're where we always are, the voice said. Why can't you see us? I looked out over the water. Nothing. No running lights, no silhouettes. Just darkness and the faint sound of water moving against itself. I called the Coast Guard. The line rang, then connected, but before I could speak, their operator started asking me questions I hadn't answered yet, repeating details from the distress calls, dates, times, names. When I cut her off and asked how she knew any of that, she went silent. Then she asked me what year I thought it was. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. The harbor water shifted again, closer this time, right beneath the pier. I stepped back, heart pounding, boots scraping on concrete. The radio erupted with shouting. Multiple boats reporting impact, listing damages that didn't make sense, describing collisions with something under the surface that moved against them with intent. One voice screamed, high and raw, and cut off mid-sound. I backed away from the edge and nearly tripped over a bollard. When I caught myself, I realized the waterline had risen. Not flooding, just higher than it should have been, creeping up the pier supports inch by inch. Dispatch. I tried again, my voice cracking now. Respond. And nothing. The shapes came back, closer, more defined. I could see outlines now, elongated forms surfacing and submerging in a slow rhythm. Between them, the water bulged upward, as if something larger was passing below. The radio crackled, and the calm voice returned. We've been waiting for midnight, it said. But it didn't come. I understood then, not fully, but enough to know I didn't want to hear any more. I shut the radio off completely and ran. I didn't make it far before the harbor lights flickered on all at once, bright and blinding, illuminating the water below. What I saw froze me in place. Boats filled the harbor, dozens of them. Old designs, newer ones, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, all packed impossibly close together. Their hulls were damaged, scraped, broken, water pouring in. People crowded the decks, waving, screaming, reaching toward the pier. And beneath them, the water moved, thick with shadows that wrapped around keels and rudders, holding them fast. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. None of these boats were in our logs. None had permission to be here. Some bore names I recognized from old incident reports, losses at sea, disappearances written off years ago. The lights went out again. Total darkness. The harbor fell silent. When the lights came back, the boats were gone. The water was calm, empty. My radio turned itself back on. Security, the calm voice said. You saw us. I quit that night. Walked off the pier and never went back. The official report listed it as a power anomaly combined with radio interference. No boats detected, no evidence found. But every New Year's Eve since, I stay away from the water. And sometimes, when the fireworks stop too suddenly, I swear I can still hear them calling for help from places that don't exist anymore, asking why no one ever came. I was crawling under the metal bleachers because my ears hurt and the noise felt too big for my head. My hands scraping dirt and crushed paper as another firework boomed overhead, and I remember thinking my parents would come back soon. That they always did, even when they said stay put, and then disappeared into crowds that all smelled like smoke and hot food. I tucked myself between two crossbars, and pressed my palms over my ears, trying to make the explosions softer, counting breaths the way my teacher said to do when things got loud. Someone laughed above me, shoes thumping on aluminum, and I felt the vibration travel down into my chest. I told myself it was fine, that hiding made sense, that I could come out when it was over. The fireworks kept going fast and bright, and I focused on the ground inches from my face. The way the dirt was packed hard with little white stones pressed into it like teeth. I noticed a bottle cap, bent and rusty, and nudged it back and forth to give myself something to do. Then the fireworks stopped all at once. The quiet came so fast it felt like someone had shoved cotton into my ears. My hands dropped to my sides without me telling them to. I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven, and far away people clapping, because they thought it was done. I waited for the next boom, the late one that always came after everyone thought it was finished. But it didn't happen. That was when I heard the screaming. At first I thought it was kids running around, maybe someone playing a joke, but it was wrong for that. It wasn't above me. It was under me. The sound came up through the ground, thin and stretched, like it had a long way to travel. I held my breath to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The screaming kept going, breaking into words I couldn't understand, then dropping back into noise again. I whispered hello, stupidly, my voice shaking as it scraped out of my throat. The screaming paused, and for a second I thought, maybe it had been my head playing tricks. Like when you hear music in the shower. Then something knocked from below, a dull thud that made the dirt tremble. I scrambled backward until my shoulders hit the back of the bleachers, my heart beating so hard it made me dizzy. I tried to crawl out, but people's legs crowded the opening, adults moving slowly now, talking in confused voices. Someone said that wasn't the finale. Someone else said maybe there was a problem. I wanted to yell for my parents, but my mouth wouldn't open. The screaming started again, closer this time, clearer, and I heard a word I recognized, a name I knew because it was mine. I slammed my hands over my ears again, pressing until it hurt, but the sound pushed through anyway. It felt like it was inside my bones. I curled up and squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear into the dirt. I thought about my room, about the poster on my wall, about my dog sleeping on my bed. Anything that wasn't this. Someone crouched down and called my name from above, my mother's voice sharp with fear. I crawled toward it, sobbing now, my knees shaking so badly I could barely move. As I reached the edge, another knock came from below, harder than before, and I screamed too, my voice joining whatever was under there. Hands grabbed me and pulled me out into the open. The lights were still on, too bright, making everything look flat and fake. My mom hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, asking what was wrong, what happened. I pointed at the ground and tried to explain, words tripping over each other. But she kept saying it was okay. It was just fireworks. It was over now. The screaming stopped as suddenly as the fireworks had. People began to leave, confused but relieved, telling each other stories about misfires and sound systems. My dad carried me to the car because my legs wouldn't work right. I kept looking back at the bleachers, waiting for something to happen, for the ground to move. But it stayed still and quiet, just dirt and metal like it always had been. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the knocking, felt the ground shake. I tried to tell my parents again in the morning, more calmly. But they exchanged looks and said, it was probably echoing pipes or my imagination. Kids imagine things, they said. Loud noises do that. A week later, the police came to our house. They asked me to show them where I'd been hiding. I didn't want to go back, but they were serious, and my parents looked scared in a way I hadn't seen before. The field was empty now, the bleachers cold and silent. I pointed to the spot, my stomach twisting as I crawled under again, the dirt the same as before. One of the officers knelt and knocked on the ground, listening. Another brought over equipment I didn't understand. They talked quietly to each other, using words I wasn't supposed to hear. Then they told me I could come out. They dug for 2 days. What they found was a sealed crawl space, older than the bleachers, hidden by years of dirt and repairs. Inside were bones, clothing, things that had once belonged to people who never went home after celebrations like the one I'd been at. The newspapers called it a forgotten place, a tragedy buried by time. They asked me questions for months after that, careful ones, gentle ones. They told me I was brave. They said what I heard could have been air moving, pressure changes, explanations that made sense on paper. I know what I heard. I don't go to fireworks anymore. I don't sit on bleachers. And sometimes, when everything is quiet and my name drifts up from memory, I still feel the ground listening back. I was already leaning forward in my chair, with my finger hovering over the mute key, when the call came back in. The same address flashing on my screen for the 3rd time in less than 5 minutes. And I remember thinking that the system had to be glitching because the line indicator never cleared between calls, like the phone had never actually hung up. I answered anyway, because that is what you do, even when your stomach tightens for no good reason. And I said my standard greeting, steady and practiced, while fireworks boomed faintly through the open windows of the station. At first there was only breathing on the other end, fast and uneven. The kind that tells you someone is panicking, but still trying to control it. I asked if anyone was injured, if there was a fire, if they were in immediate danger. And then the breathing turned into screaming so loud, I had to pull the headset away from my ear. It was raw and desperate and cut off abruptly, like someone had put a hand over the caller's mouth. The line stayed open. I could hear crackling, a distant roar, and something like wood snapping. I logged it as a possible structure fire and tried to reconnect verbally, calling out, asking for confirmation, for any response at all. Nothing came back except that same low roar. When the call dropped, I sat there staring at the empty line, my heart pounding harder than it should have for something I dealt with every night. Fires happen. Screams happen. This was not my first New Year's Eve shift. Still, my hands felt clammy when the same address lit up again almost immediately. The second time, the voice was clearer, closer, as if the caller had moved right up to the phone. She was crying now, words tumbling over each other, saying there were too many people inside, that the door was blocked, that the decorations were burning too fast. I asked for the address even though it was already on my screen, and she said it exactly as written, then added details that made my skin prickle, describing a house I somehow felt I could see, even though I had never been there. I dispatched the fire brigade while she was still talking, my voice calm by instinct, asking her to get low, to find another exit, to stay on the line. The fireworks outside grew louder, closer to midnight now, and for a split second the contrast made me angry. That people were celebrating while this woman was trapped and terrified. Then she screamed again, a long, broken sound that ended in a wet cough, and the line went silent without disconnecting. The third call came through before the units had even acknowledged the dispatch. This time there was no crying, no words at all. Just the sound of fire, unmistakable, and something else beneath it, a rhythmic thumping that took me a moment to recognize as fists hitting a wall. I leaned forward, every muscle tight, telling her I was still there, that help was coming, even as a strange certainty crept in that help was not going to matter. One of my colleagues glanced over, eyebrows raised, and asked what was going on. I told him it was a house fire with people trapped, and he frowned at the address on my screen. He said that place was a vacant lot now, that the house had burned down years ago. I snapped at him to check the database, because I could still hear the fire, could still hear that thumping growing weaker. He did check, and his face drained of color as the records came up. The house had burned on New Year's Eve, years before I joined the service. Party. Faulty decorations. Multiple fatalities. I stared at the screen, at the date, at the photos attached to the report, and felt something inside me refuse to line up. I told myself it had to be a prank, a crossed line, some kind of technical echo pulling old data into the present. But the call was still live, still making noise, still very real in my ears. I asked the caller her name. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she whispered it, so softly I almost missed it, and it matched one of the names in the fatality report exactly. I felt cold all over, like someone had opened a door inside me. My colleague swore under his breath and reached for the supervisor, but I kept talking because stopping felt unthinkable, like abandoning her all over again. I told her to follow my voice, to tell me where she was in the house. She said she was in the lounge, that the ceiling was dripping, that the balloons had melted. I could picture it too easily, and when I glanced at the report again, I saw the same room described there, the same details noted by investigators long ago. Fireworks outside hit a rapid crescendo, and through the phone I heard another explosion, closer, sharper, followed by a sudden rush of air. She started coughing hard, and I told her to get down, to crawl if she could, even though some part of me knew she could not hear me the way I was hearing her. The thumping stopped. The fire roared louder, then faltered, then surged again. My supervisor stood behind me now, silent, listening, his face pale and drawn. He told me quietly to disconnect the call. I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes, and kept talking. The fireworks reached midnight. Cheering erupted outside the station, muffled and distant, while on my headset the fire finally consumed whatever had been holding it back. There was a sound like a collapse, a rush of air so loud it hurt, and then nothing at all. The line went dead on its own. The address disappeared from my screen. The room felt too quiet, too still, like everything was waiting to see what I would do next. We sat there for a long time after, none of us speaking. The fire brigade radioed in, confused, saying there was no fire, no house, nothing to respond to. My supervisor logged the incident as a system fault and told us all to take a break. I went outside and listened to the last echoes of celebration fade, my hands shaking so badly I had to sit down. I finished my shift in a fog, answering calls that felt unreal, like I was watching someone else do my job. When dawn came, I went home and slept without dreaming, a heavy, blank sleep that left me no relief. In the days that followed, I pulled the old reports, read everything I could find about that fire, about the woman whose name I had heard whispered through the line. Her last recorded action had been calling for help. I stayed in dispatch for years after that night, long enough to see technology change and systems improve. But I never worked another New Year's Eve. Every time fireworks went off, my chest tightened, waiting for a call that never came again. I know now that some moments do not stay where they belong. That fear can echo forward just as easily as sound. When I hear people talk about that old fire, about how tragic it was, I think about how the line never really rang off, and how someone, somewhere, was still waiting for an answer that could never arrive. I had the blade down and the truck in low gear when the fireworks cut off mid-burst. The sudden silence hitting so hard, it made me ease my foot off the accelerator without thinking. 1 second, there was that distant popping, echoing faintly over the trees. The next there was nothing but the engine rumble and my own breathing. I remember muttering that someone at the town office must have messed up the schedule, because it felt easier than admitting how wrong that silence felt, like the world had paused without asking permission. I leaned forward in my seat, squinting through the windshield, because the road ahead didn't look right. I knew this road. I'd driven it dozens of times, especially on nights like this, when most people were indoors celebrating and the streets were supposed to be empty. But there, right where the road dipped and curved toward the tree line, there were people. A lot of them, standing shoulder to shoulder across the road, completely still. I slowed until the truck was barely crawling. My first thought was that there'd been an accident, some kind of detour that hadn't been radioed in. My second thought, the one that made my chest tighten, was that none of them were wearing winter gear. No coats, no hats. Just dark shapes against the snow, unmoving, facing me. I tapped the horn once, a short, polite sound, expecting them to step aside or at least react. No one did. The crowd didn't shift. No heads turned. They just stood there, blocking the road like they'd been placed there deliberately. I reached for the radio and called dispatch, telling them I had a group of pedestrians on an unmarked stretch outside my assigned zone. I asked if there was an event I hadn't been told about. The radio crackled. Then the dispatcher answered, confused, telling me there shouldn't be anyone out there, that all public gatherings had wrapped up earlier because of the cold. As she spoke, I noticed something else that made my throat dry. There were no footprints leading to the crowd. The snow in front of them was smooth and untouched, like they'd appeared without walking there. Behind them, toward the trees, the snow was darker, churned up, packed down. I told dispatch I was stopping to check, because that's what you do when something doesn't add up and you're responsible for a municipal vehicle. I set the brake, killed the blade, and opened the door. The cold hit me hard enough to steal my breath for a moment, and the silence felt heavier outside the cab, pressing in on my ears. I stepped down onto the road and called out, asking if anyone needed help. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. No one answered. Up close, I could see faces now, pale and slack eyes open but unfocused, like they were looking through me instead of at me. I took another step forward, then another, my boots crunching loud in the quiet. I was close enough to reach out when it happened. The entire crowd vanished at once. Not scattered, not ran, just gone. 1 second they were there, the next there was empty road. I stood there staring at nothing, my hand half raised, my mind scrambling to catch up. The road was empty, just me and the truck, and the forest pressing in from both sides. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. Then I looked down. The footprints were still there. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading off the road and into the trees on the right side. They weren't random. They were organized, packed close together, all pointed in the same direction, like a crowd moving with purpose. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off those tracks, until I hit the side of the truck. I climbed back into the cab with shaking hands and slammed the door, locking it out of reflex. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. A trick of light, exhaustion, too much coffee, and not enough sleep. I radioed dispatch again, my voice tighter now, and told them the people were gone, but the tracks were still there. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I checked the radio to make sure it hadn't cut out. When she answered, her voice was different, lower. She asked me to repeat myself. I did. Slower, clearer. She told me to stay in the vehicle and wait. She said she was calling it in to the supervisor. I asked her how people could disappear like that. She didn't answer. While I waited, I watched the tree line. The forest looked the same as it always had, dark and dense, branches heavy. But I had the overwhelming sense that something in there was moving away from me, retreating deeper, carrying something with it. The radio crackled again, and this time it wasn't dispatch. It was my supervisor telling me to mark the road as clear and return to the depot. His tone was clipped, final, like he didn't want to discuss it. I asked him if anyone else was coming to check the site. He said no. I asked him why. He told me to follow instructions. I did what I was told. I turned the truck around, careful not to drive over the footprints, and headed back the way I'd come. As I drove, the fireworks started up again in the distance, late and scattered, like someone had remembered they were supposed to be happening. Back at the depot, no one met me. No questions, no report forms. When I tried to bring it up, the supervisor cut me off, told me to go home and sleep it off. He said the road was scheduled for rework anyway, that the maps would be updated. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces, the way they'd stared through me. The next morning, I drove back out there in my own car. The road was gone. Where it had dipped and curved, there was nothing but fresh snow and a stand of young trees. No tracks. No sign anyone had ever stood there. I checked the maps at the office later that week. The stretch of road I'd been plowing wasn't on them anymore. When I asked about it, I was told it had been decommissioned years earlier, after a logging accident. People had gone missing. The area was sealed off. I'd never been assigned there. I quit that spring. I still avoid that part of town. And every New Year's Eve, when the fireworks pause, I remember that road and the crowd that didn't belong to my time, waiting for something I was never meant to see. I was adjusting the focus ring on the camera when the first firework went up. My fingers numb from holding the tripod steady while the town below waited for midnight. I remember thinking that I liked working alone because no one stared at me the way they did in crowds. No one asked questions I didn't want to answer. And the hillside felt neutral, quiet, like it didn't care who I was. I framed the skyline, checked the audio levels, and told myself this would be an easy job. Just footage to sell later, nothing personal, nothing that required me to stay once the show ended. The fireworks started slow, scattered bursts that gave me time to settle into the rhythm of recording. Breathing, watching the meters, letting muscle memory take over. I wasn't watching the town so much as the screen, making sure nothing clipped, nothing blew out, nothing ruined the shot. When the first scream cut through the air, I thought it was cheering. The kind of sharp sound people make when they're drunk and excited, and I didn't even lift my head. The second scream was different. It didn't rise. It cracked. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that ran up my spine and made my shoulders tense. I glanced away from the screen toward the town, but from that distance I couldn't see anything unusual. Fireworks kept going. The soundscape stayed mostly the same. I told myself it was nothing and went back to the camera. Another scream followed, closer this time, and then another, overlapping, uneven. I remember my mouth going dry and the thought sliding in, uninvited, that people don't scream like that for fun. I turned fully toward the town, scanning for movement, for smoke, for anything that made sense. But all I saw were lights and shadows shifting with each explosion. I checked the time code, half expecting to see some glitch, something to explain the unease, but it was running clean. The camera was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I raised the viewfinder to my eye again, and that was when I noticed the first figure. It wasn't clear. It wasn't dramatic. Just a shape where there hadn't been one before, standing a few steps behind me. Close enough that I should have felt them, if they were real. I lowered the camera and turned around, heart thudding, ready to snap at whoever had climbed up here without saying anything. But there was no one there. The hillside was empty. I could see all the way down to the path. No movement. No sound except the fireworks and the distant screaming. I told myself it was a trick of perspective, a reflection, some artifact on the lens. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, checked for smudges, then lifted the camera again. The figure was still there, clearer now, standing upright, facing the same direction I was, as if watching the town with me. I spun around again, faster this time, pulse hammering in my ears. Still nothing. The air felt wrong, heavy in a way I couldn't explain, like it was waiting. I laughed under my breath, a sharp, nervous sound, and said out loud that I was tired, that my brain was filling in gaps. Hearing my own voice helped, just a little. Another scream tore through the night, and on the screen, another figure appeared, then another, forming a loose line behind me. None of them moved. None of them looked at the camera. They just stood there, silent, while the town below seemed to unravel. I dropped the camera, not caring if it caught the moment or not, and turned around again, shouting into the empty hillside, demanding to know who was there. My voice echoed back to me, thin and lonely. No footsteps. No replies. I felt stupid and scared at the same time, which somehow made it worse. I picked the camera back up because it felt safer to look through it than to trust my own eyes. The figures hadn't changed, but now I could see details. The way their outlines blurred at the edges. The way they seemed slightly out of sync with the fireworks, lit a fraction of a second too late. As another scream rang out, one of the figures tilted its head, just a little, and I flinched hard enough to almost drop everything again. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled it out, grateful for the interruption, and saw a text from a friend asking if I was hearing the noise too. Before I could reply, another message came through, then another, people asking what was happening, if I knew, if I'd seen anything. I typed back that I was on a hill, filming, that I didn't understand it either, and hit send with shaking hands. When I looked back at the camera, the figures were closer. Not closer to me, exactly, but more present, filling the frame in a way that made my skin crawl. I could feel their nearness, even though I couldn't feel anything physical. The screaming below had become constant now, a raw, tearing sound that rose and fell like waves. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped between looking and not looking, until the fireworks stopped. One moment they were there, the next they weren't, and the sudden absence of sound was so complete it made my ears ring. The screaming didn't stop. Without the explosions to cover it, it was unbearable. On the screen, the figures reacted. Not dramatically. They straightened, aligned, all facing forward now. And for the first time, I realized they weren't looking at the town. They were looking past it, toward something I couldn't see. Toward the future, maybe. Toward me. I shut the camera off. I didn't think. I just did it, desperate to make it stop. The hillside felt colder without the glow of the screen, emptier and somehow more crowded at the same time. I stood there, breathing hard, telling myself it was over, that whatever I'd seen couldn't follow me if I didn't let it. The screaming faded slowly, not ending so much as thinning out, until it was just isolated cries, then nothing. Midnight came and went without ceremony. No cheers, no countdown. Just a hollow quiet that felt wrong. I packed up with shaking hands and left without looking back, half running down the path, expecting at any moment to feel a hand on my shoulder, a presence at my back. Nothing happened. The town was shaken but intact when I reached it. People confused, emergency lights flashing, explanations forming that didn't quite fit. I didn't tell anyone about the figures. I told myself I wouldn't even check the footage, that it was better not to know. That lasted until morning. Curiosity and dread pulled me back to my computer, my heart racing as I loaded the files. The footage was clean. No glitches. No artifacts. And there they were, clear as day, standing behind me, during every moment the screaming peaked. The timestamps lined up perfectly with emergency reports that followed over the next hours. Each time something happened, they appeared. Each time it ended, they faded. I deleted the files. Every copy. I stopped filming after that. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. Couldn't forget the feeling of being observed by something that only existed when people suffered. I'm telling you now because I trust you. Because I need someone else to know that I wasn't imagining it, that the camera saw what my eyes couldn't. I don't film fireworks anymore. I don't stand with my back to empty spaces. And every New Year's Eve, when the screaming starts somewhere far away, I make sure there's nothing behind me that a camera could see. I was leaning back in my chair, stretching my neck, when the first camera froze, and at the time it barely registered as anything more than irritation. That room was my whole world for 12 hours at a stretch screens, hum, stale coffee, the low murmur of radios. One frozen feed meant a ticket, a log entry, maybe a call if it didn't clear on its own. I rolled my chair forward, tapped the keyboard, and watched as another screen locked into place. The fireworks mid-bloom, colors smeared into still shapes like paint trapped under glass. I muttered to myself and checked the system clock. It was close to midnight, close enough that glitches weren't unusual. Everyone was out celebrating, bandwidth strained, people firing off videos and messages. I told myself it was that. Still, when the third screen froze, then the fourth, a tightness crept into my chest that I didn't want to name yet. I keyed the radio and told Mika at the North substation that I was seeing widespread feed freezes. He laughed and said something about the city deciding to take the new year off early. I forced a chuckle back, even as I watched the rest of the screens lock one by one. Within seconds, every single feed in the room was frozen on some variation of celebration. Crowds looking up, hands raised, bursts of light hanging impossibly still above them. Then the sound cut out. Not just the fireworks audio, but everything. The low background hiss from the room vanished. The radio went dead in my hand. Even the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed to disappear. It felt like someone had pressed a hand over my ears. I remember swallowing hard and suddenly being very aware of my own breathing. Too loud, too fast. I checked the clock again, because part of me needed to anchor myself to something measurable. Midnight hit. The numbers rolled over cleanly. No alarm sounded. No systems rebooted. The screens stayed frozen. For a few seconds, nothing happened at all, and in that empty space, I felt stupid for being scared. I was about to start the reboot sequence when the sound came back all at once. Screaming filled the room. It blasted from the wall speakers, from my headset lying on the desk, from the radio I dropped without realizing it. Men, women, children, overlapping, rising and falling in waves. Not cheering, not drunken shouts, but raw. Panicked screams that made my skin prickle and my stomach twist. I spun in my chair, eyes darting across the screens, expecting to see riots, fires, something that explained that sound. But the images were unchanged. Every screen still showed frozen celebrations, smiling faces, fireworks suspended forever in midair. I shouted into the radio, called for Mika again, for anyone, but my voice sounded small against the screaming. No one answered. I pulled my headset on, then ripped it off again, because the sound felt too close, like it was inside my skull. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to sit on them for a second just to stop. Training kicked in eventually. The muscle memory of procedures drilled into me over years. I started isolating audio channels, muting feeds one by one. The screams persisted, even when every input was supposedly cut. That was when the fear sharpened into something colder. If it wasn't coming from the cameras, where was it coming from? I stood up and walked closer to the screens, scanning faces, looking for any sign of movement I might have missed. Nothing? A child's face filled one monitor, mouth open in a laugh, eyes bright, frozen forever in that moment. Over the speakers, a child screamed until their voice cracked. I backed away from the console, heart pounding. I remember saying out loud that this wasn't possible, like the room needed to hear it. The sound began to thin, individual screams dropping out until only a few remained, then one long and hoarse, before cutting off abruptly. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. My radio crackled, and Mika's voice came through, shaky, asking if I was hearing what he was hearing. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. I told him yes, asked him what the hell was going on. He said all their feeds had frozen too. Same thing, same sound. Then he said something that made my mouth go dry. He said people were calling emergency lines, but there was nothing to report. No visible incidents. Just screaming. We stayed on the line, comparing notes, trying to troubleshoot remotely when one of my screens flickered. Just a blink, barely noticeable, but enough to make me lean forward. The image updated by a fraction of a second. In that sliver of motion, I saw the crowd's faces change. Fear replaced joy. Mouths opened wider. Hands that had been raised in celebration twisted into claws. Then the feed froze again. I felt sick. The sound returned, quieter this time, like it was coming from far away, echoing down long corridors. I realized it wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from the walls themselves, vibrating through concrete and metal. I pressed my palm against the surface and felt it trembling faintly. Mika was still talking, but his voice distorted, stretching and warping until it sounded wrong, slowed down, then sped up. I shouted his name, and he shouted mine, both of us panicking now, and then the line went dead again. I don't know how long I stood there alone. Time felt slippery, untrustworthy. Eventually, the system clock jumped forward by several minutes without explanation. The feeds unfroze all at once. Every screen showed empty streets. Fireworks lay scattered on the ground, unlit, abandoned. No people, no movement. The audio feeds were silent. I scanned camera after camera, searching for someone, anyone, but the city looked evacuated, wiped clean in the space of a few impossible minutes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mika. Just 3 words, they are gone. I left the surveillance room without signing out. I drove through streets I knew by heart, headlights cutting through emptiness. I didn't see a single person until dawn. Later, officials called it a mass hysteria event, a psychological phenomenon. They said the screaming was panic amplified by sound systems, by fear feeding on itself. But I was there. I heard it before anyone could have known to be afraid. And sometimes, when the city is quiet, I still hear it humming faintly through the walls, counting down to a moment we already survived, somehow, without ever understanding the cost. I was halfway through noting fresh tracks along the tree line, when the first firework cracked overhead, sharp enough to send a ripple through the woods. And I paused with my pencil hovering, listening to the way the deer bolted before the echo finished. That reaction was the whole point of my assignment, tracking how wildlife responded to sudden noise. So I kept my breathing steady and marked the time, telling myself to stay focused even as another explosion rolled across the sky. I remember thinking how strange it was to be out there alone on New Year's Eve, while everyone else was gathered in town, but solitude had always felt safer to me than crowds. The third firework went off lower, closer, and the forest reacted all at once. Birds burst upward, wings tearing through branches. Squirrels fled along the trunks, and something heavier crashed away deeper in the brush. I turned slowly, scanning, counting movement, forcing myself not to jump. This was data. This mattered. I whispered the species names as I recognized them, grounding myself in routine, reminding myself I was here, because I was good at this, because I noticed patterns other people missed. Then the fireworks stopped. Not tapered off, not paused between launches, but stopped completely, leaving a silence so abrupt it felt like pressure on my ears. The animals didn't settle. They ran harder. I heard hooves tearing through snow, bodies smashing into undergrowth, a frantic, directional retreat that made no sense unless something else had entered the woods. My first thought was predators, maybe a cougar spooked by the noise, but the direction was wrong. Everything was fleeing away from the town, deeper into paths that didn't lead anywhere. I turned off my headlamp and stood still, listening. That's when I heard the screaming. It didn't come from one place. It threaded through the trees, echoing off trunks, rising and falling as if the sound itself was moving. Human voices, unmistakable, layered over each other in panic, calling out names, calling for help. My stomach dropped, and my first instinct was to run toward it, because that's what you do when someone is in trouble. Then my brain caught up, reminding me where I was. There were no houses past this line, no roads, no reason for anyone to be out there, especially not screaming like that. I called out anyway, my voice cracking as it bounced back to me, unanswered. The screaming grew louder, closer, then shifted abruptly to my left, like the source had moved without crossing the space between. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar edge of fear sharpening into something colder. I had spent years learning to trust my instincts, especially after so many people told me I shouldn't trust myself, but this felt different. This felt wrong. I keyed my radio and called in, explaining what I was hearing, asking if there was an emergency in town, if responders were already on it. Static answered me, thick and heavy. Then a dispatcher's voice broke through, asking me to repeat myself. I did, slower, clearer, and she went quiet for a moment before saying there were no reports of disturbances, no emergency calls, no fireworks incidents. She asked if I might be confusing animal noise with something else. Another scream tore through the woods, so close I flinched, and I shouted into the radio that this was human, that someone needed help. The dispatcher told me to return to my vehicle immediately and wait. I said I couldn't just leave, not if someone was out there, and she repeated the instruction, firmer this time. Against my better judgment, I listened. I backed away from the tree line, every step feeling like a betrayal. As I reached the narrow path leading back, the screams followed, pacing me, staying just beyond sight. I forced myself not to run, afraid that sudden movement would draw whatever this was closer. My boots crunched too loudly, each sound an announcement of where I was. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look into the dark gaps between trees where the sound seemed to gather. When I reached my truck, relief hit me so hard my knees shook. I climbed in, locked the doors, and turned the engine over, the noise impossibly loud after the silence. The radio crackled to life without me touching it, not with music or voices, but with the same screaming I'd heard outside, now flattened and distorted, looping endlessly. I slammed it off, heart pounding, and drove. The road back skirted the woods for a few kilometers, and as I drove, I saw movement at the edge of my headlights, shapes darting parallel to me, keeping pace no matter how I adjusted my speed. I told myself it was animals, shadows, adrenaline making patterns where there were none. Then I saw a figure step onto the road ahead, just long enough for my headlights to illuminate a face twisted in terror before vanishing into the trees. I braked hard and sat there shaking, hands locked on the wheel, breathing shallow. Logic screamed at me to keep going, to get back to town where there were lights and people and answers. Another part of me knew that whatever I'd seen wasn't going to be solved by distance. The screams faded as abruptly as the fireworks had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own pulse. Town was intact when I reached it. People stood around confused, fireworks half unpacked, asking why the show had ended early. No one else had heard anything. No one else had seen anything. When I tried to explain, words tangled in my mouth, the story sounding less real the more I told it. The dispatcher met me in person later, concerned but skeptical, suggesting stress, suggesting I take the night off. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the woods breathing, heard footsteps where there should have been none. Over the next weeks, reports trickled in. Missing people. Hikers who vanished on familiar trails. Search parties that reported hearing voices calling from impossible distances. The patterns were the same paths I'd marked, the ones that led nowhere. I went back once during the day with others following protocol. We found nothing. No tracks. No signs of struggle. Just an unnatural quiet where the forest should have been alive. I quit volunteering after that. Changed jobs. Moved closer to town. But every New Year's Eve, when fireworks crack and then fade, I listen for the moment they stop, for the sound that might follow. It's been years now, and I still don't go into the woods alone. I don't need proof anymore. I know what I heard. I know what followed the animals out of those trees. And I know it learned something that night. It learned when the noise ends, and people are distracted, and the forest belongs to it again.